So today I'm going to talk about, is it time to incorporate psychological health and safety into aviation? What you see there is Trinity College. That's where I'm based. Trinity College is the oldest and most prestigious university in Ireland, established in 1592 by Queen Elizabeth I. It's a sister university of both Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. Trinity is renowned for its quality of research. If you look at the main courtyard there, the School of Psychology is based just over here on the left-hand side, and then behind this building is a little-known institute in Trinity called the Institute of Nonsense. The Institute of Nonsense has produced some very good research. Only today, would you believe, it was actually covered in the Norwegian media. Canaries. Since 1896, they put canaries in the coal mines across the UK. It started in Wales. The canaries were very perceptible to carbon monoxide. They would die before the miners. This was a trigger that there was something wrong with the atmosphere. However, the Institute of Nonsense has reported that it was a waste of time. The canaries died needlessly. All they needed, as the article says, scientists from Trinity College Institute of Nonsense have reported that if the canaries in the coal mines across Europe had simply been given a fellow canary to talk to, or a yoga mat, that they would have most likely have survived and not succumbed to the toxic fumes present in the mine on the day that the canary died. Absolute nonsense. But is that any more nonsense than the way we're trying to manage mental health in pilots at the moment? I would argue it's no different. Absolute nonsense. There have been studies done on pilot mental health. You may be aware of some of them. The most high profile, I believe, is the one that was done in 2016 by Harvard, reported that 12.6% of pilots were meeting the threshold for moderate clinical depression. 2 years later, BALPA, in conjunction with the University of Eindhoven, measured levels of burnout. They reported that 40% of British pilots were meeting the threshold for moderate levels of burnout. Over the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to argue that we need to change the approach. We need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream, and as Desmond Tutu said, we need to find out why they're falling in the first place. That is not being done in aviation at the moment. For the last 9 years, I've been trying to understand what is going on with pilots and mental health. I lead a research project called the Lived Experience Wellbeing Project. In 2018 and 2019, we conducted what I believe to be the most in-depth study that has ever been done on commercial airline pilots. We didn't have the largest sample. We had 1,000 pilots. However, 1,000 pilots completed a survey that had 185 questions in it. We looked at everything. We did what Harvard did. We did what Eindhoven did. We measured the levels of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and burnout. But we went much deeper. We looked at why they were falling into the river. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. Part of our research involved a series of workshops with pilots. We brought pilots into the room and we asked them to discuss what was happening with the pilots, with their health, and how this was impacting safety. The most commonly identified scenario that pilots identified was where pilots are coping mostly well. There's no impact on safety. The next most common scenario they reported was where pilots are mostly coping, but there is an impact on their health. Once again, there was no safety implication. Minor errors, but the pilots were correcting themselves. The next most common was where pilots are experiencing a difficulty, but they are mostly coping well. The pilots were making errors that may have led to a near miss, but they were being picked up by the other pilot. The next most common scenario described was where pilots are mostly coping, but there's long-term impacts on their health. There was no safety implication because these were dormant issues. This was something that over a 10, 15, 20-year period was going to end up in the pilot developing a health issue towards the end of their career that was being caused by the previous 10, 15 years. The next one was where pilots were not coping. They were taking themselves out of the system, either they were or the aeromedical examiner was pulling their license, and by default, because they're no longer in the cockpit, there was no safety implication. The final one, which is the one that gets most attention in aviation, is the extreme case. The highly catastrophic, but highly exceptionally rare case, the likes of Germanwings, where there's a potential for a serious incident or a fatal accident. Let's talk about pilot suicide. This is something we're not comfortable talking about. Over the last 33 years, we've counted that there's been 7 fatal accidents that either were attributed to pilot suicide or all the suggestions are that it was. Those 33 years, 7 fatal accidents, 919 fatalities. Looking at the big picture, over that 33-year period, 981 fatal accidents, 23,686 fatalities. How many were deliberately caused? 0.7% of the fatal accidents were deliberately caused, and 3.9% of the fatalities were deliberately caused. Yet that gets all the attention. So, I believe we need to change the narrative around pilot mental health. 0.7% were deliberately caused. What were the other 99.3% deliberately caused by? Emmanuel just spoke about human error. 70 to 80% of accidents have been caused by human error. What caused the human error? I believe we need to look at what I call a whippet. It's a well-intentioned pilot in a distressed state. And we also need to think about the millions of other safe flights, as Emmanuel just spoke about. What was the role of positive mental health? Mental health is not necessarily something to be feared. We're talking about mental health, not mental ill health. Big difference. If we go back to the 6 scenarios, it's the last one that has been getting all the attention. However, I believe we're looking in the wrong place. We need to be looking upstream. We need to be looking at scenario 3, where errors are leading to a near miss, but they've been picked up by the other pilot. What if both pilots are not bringing their A game into the cockpit, and they're not watching each other because there's stuff going on in their head? And that leads to an error, which leads to a serious incident or a fatal accident. I believe that a significant number of the 99.3% of accidents that I've just spoken about are due to scenario 3, not scenario 6. I believe it's the whippets, the well-intentioned pilots in distressed states that are contributing to these accidents, yet they are not being looked at. This graph, very similar, was shown earlier on, and as we can see, things are getting better. We are getting safer. However, if we look at the last 10 years, since 1990, 3.9% of accidents were possibly deliberately caused. If we look at the last 10 years, this figure rises to 20.6% of accidents were possibly fatally caused. And if we take Boeing out of the picture and forget about the 737 MAX, that figure rises to nearly 25% of accidents fatally caused, deliberately caused. And I'd ask, is there something in the water? What's causing this? Also bear in mind, these figures, bar China Eastern, were pre-COVID. And as we know, COVID was not just a biological contagion. The World Health Organization have warned of a mental health eco-pandemic, which I believe we're starting to see now in general society. So why would pilots, why would air traffic controllers, cabin crew engineers, why would we be any different? I want to go back to this. We have been talking about flight safety. However, as we know, aviation is an ultra-safe form of transport. What was it someone said? 100,000 years every day before you're going to be in a fatal accident? It is ultra-safe as a mode of transport. We can't deny that. However, as an occupation, it's far from ultra-safe. I would go as far as saying it's a dangerous occupation. I will expand on that. You may think I've been dramatic, but I will expand on it. Harvard, 12.6%. The University of Eindhoven, 40% burnout. Why? They never really explained why. They explained the what, but they didn't look at the why. That's where we came to the table. We wanted to understand the why. With our study, we found that 17% of our sample were meeting the threshold for moderate clinical depression. We also found that 35% were meeting the threshold for moderate burnout. It's not totally dissimilar. Harvard was a US population. The Eindhoven study was just the UK. We were mostly European with some from the United States. So we didn't expect to get the exact same figures, but I would argue that they're quite similar. What was quite alarming though was the overlap. Almost 1 in 3 pilots who were burnt out also met the threshold for depression. Our study wasn't designed in such a way that we could demonstrate causality. However, there's dozens of studies that have demonstrated that burnout can and will lead to depression in many cases. We asked the participants to list, from this list of well-being issues, which have you experienced and are either you attribute or believe were worsened by your job as a pilot. The most common issue that pilots reported was sleep difficulties. 81% reported sleep difficulties. Next most common, 73.5% musculoskeletal, followed by digestive issues, loneliness, marital discord, psychological distress, respiratory issues, and cardiovascular problems. So, how do we do better? How do we stop the people from falling into the river? How can we do better than just rolling out yoga mats, offering yoga at lunchtime? We can do much better. The World Health Organization advocates for an integrated approach to workplace well-being. What they suggest is the most important thing is to prevent harm. It's our primary interventions. You prevent the harm first of all. When that doesn't work, you have secondary interventions, promoting positive behaviours, positive lifestyle. And finally, it's your tertiary, responding to problems. That's where we are. Most of our efforts are here. Peer support, employee assistance programs, critical incident response programs. We have a little bit here. But as regards people going into the river, it's like offering swimming lessons, but not actually checking can the people swim. We gave it a lesson, but we've no idea whether the lessons actually worked. That's what the airlines are doing with well-being programs. But they're doing nothing here to prevent harm. This approach was mirrored recently by the US Surgeon General. They came up with something, the Workplace Mental Health and Wellbeing Initiative. It's very similar to Martin Seligman's program for flourishing and the PERMA model. There's 5 areas he promotes, but the first one is the protection of harm. And the first step of protecting harm is to prioritize workplace physical and psychological safety. Now, I want to clarify something here. There's a lot of confusion around psychological safety and psychological health and safety. I've clarified with the US Surgeon General what they actually mean is psychological health and safety. You may have come across Amy Edmondson and her idea of psychological safety. Psychological safety is an outcome. It's the belief that you won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up on questions, ideas, concerns, or mistakes. It's an outcome. Psychological health and safety, however, is a process. It's a process that identifies hazards and manages risk to psychological well-being. This is the hierarchy of controls, which is typically used in health and safety. I'm not going to go into much detail in this, but at the top, you have the elimination of hazards. These are the most difficult to do. However, they're the most effective. At the bottom, you have the least effective, but they're the easiest things to do. That's what we do in health and safety. And in a moment, I'll discuss how we can do that with psychological health and safety. Psychosocial hazards are anything in the design of work, the management of work, and the social context of work. And these hazards have the potential to cause psychosocial harm. Psychosocial harm can be distress, anxiety, depression, burnout, or PTSD. So, burnout was one of the things I mentioned at the start of the presentation. The World Health Organization are very clear. Burnout is not a medical condition. It doesn't happen to weak, vulnerable people who have no resilience. Burnout is an occupational phenomenon. However, it leads to many medical conditions, including depression. It's caused by chronic workplace stress that has been unsuccessfully managed. I want to go back to this chart. These were the well-being issues that pilots said were causing them problems. Every single one of those problems can be caused by burnout. Every single one. So what is burnout and why should we be concerned about it? Burnout is characterized by exhaustion. It's characterized by cynicism and disengagement and reduced professional efficacy. Any one of those three things has no place in the cockpit of an airplane. However, burnout will bring all three. This is the jobs demands theory model. This is the model that we use to assess burnout and to explain it in pilots. I don't have time. I need the full 2 days of this conference to fully explain that. But basically, up here we have job demands. Work pressure, emotional demands, and work-life balance or imbalance is going to put demand on the worker, which is going to lead to exhaustion. Job resources. This is what makes the job positive. This is what makes the job easy. When there's not enough of that, we become cynical. And exhaustion and cynicism are going to impact our performance. We asked pilots to indicate sources of work-related stress that they felt were impacting their health and their well-being. The most commonly cited one was irregular hours, followed by antisocial hours, divergence of values, long duties, unhealthy food, lack of engagement, inflexible annual leave, and then there's a few more there as well. I'm not going to go through them all. You might ask, why are some of them red? Why are some of them green? If you're someone who has an issue with working irregular hours, is aviation really the career for you? If you don't like working antisocial hours, if you don't like working long duties, maybe you're in the wrong job. However, there are some of those things that can be changed and are under the control of the employer. They're the ones that need to be tackled. We can't get rid of every hazard in the workplace. If you want to be ultra safe, don't ever leave your house. We have to deal with some of them, but we can't deal with them all. I want to talk about normalisation of deviance. The Hurler Free Enterprise was mentioned earlier on. What those guys did with the doors in that boat, that happened most days. There was nothing really out of the ordinary. It was normal. At least they had normalised it. The Challenger, almost every launch had issues with frozen O-rings. RAF Nimrod in Afghanistan, we know what happened there with the fuel pumps. They knew about it for a long time. As they say, your accident is waiting in your data. Corsica Concordia, that guy sailed by that island plenty of times. Didn't cause a problem until the day it did. Little goldfish in his goldfish bowl. That's an aviation worker. That's a pilot. That's an air traffic controller. Most of us have been living in a goldfish bowl since we left school. Most of us have been in the same job, the same industry. We look around. Everyone else is working shift work. Everyone else is eating the same shitty food that's served on the airplane. Everyone else is working antisocial hours. We know no different. All we know is our goldfish bowl. However, that does not make it right. Just because it's normal doesn't mean it's right. I want to go back now to the canary in the mine, our little alarm system. James Reason said we cannot change the human condition. However, we can change the conditions under which people work. When a goldfish gets sick, you don't blame the goldfish. You change the water. When a plant fails to thrive, we don't blame the plant. We treat the soil. We treat the environment in which the plant grows in. We treat the environment in which the goldfish lives in. It should be the very same for aviation workers. However, it's not. All the focus is going on the aviation worker. Let's make the aviation worker more resilient. Let's give him a bulletproof vest. Why not reduce the number of bullets? Why not look at who's firing the gun? Maybe the industry doesn't want to look at it because they know that they're the one firing the gun. So how do we actually do this? We conduct what's called a psychosocial risk assessment. I'm just going to rattle through the next few slides. It's about what psychosocial risk assessments do and what they don't do. Because I've spoken to airlines who told me and have shown me what they've done and said, oh yeah, we do psychosocial risk management. And I looked and goes, no you don't. That's not psychosocial risk management. That's a paper exercise. So a psychosocial risk assessment, they do determine what it is in the design, management and social aspects of work that have the potential to cause harm. Harm doesn't have to be caused. It's the potential to cause harm that has to be addressed. They do not identify individuals who are mentally unwell. So your peer support program is not a psychosocial risk management tool. They do consult workers on the severity of the stress caused by the exposure to the psychosocial hazard, and most importantly, the frequency and the duration of this exposure. That's really, really important. What might seem as simple and innocuous If that worker is experiencing that day in, day out, that's going to grind them down, it's going to do harm. They do not consider psychosocial hazards in isolation. You have to look at the complex interactions of the different hazards. They do evaluate when workers are exposed to multiple psychosocial hazards and how they interact and combine to cause harm. It's the interactions that's really, really important to be addressed. They do not assume that every worker has the same risk profile. When you're doing a hazard assessment on a physical hazard, you can assume that if you throw every worker out of the top floor of a building, they're going to sustain the same type of injury. However, psychosocial harm is totally different. It's dependent on the risk profile of the different groups. These assessments do identify teams, role types and demographics that have a higher risk of harm than other groups. And they do not treat issues all the same. They do take a risk-based approach and they eliminate at source or reduce risk so as far as is reasonably practical, in line with the ALARP principle. Psychosocial risk management, it is not rocket science. It's a totally different science. We put a man on the moon. Our industry understands how to build airplanes. However, I would argue it does not understand psychosocial risk and how it affects the mental health of its staff. It's a different skill set. We spoke earlier on about Boeing needing to bring in know-how and expertise from outside. I believe the industry needs to bring in expertise from outside because we're not getting this. This is the hierarchy of needs that I spoke about earlier on, adjusted for psychosocial risk. So what do? At the top, we can eliminate working conditions that threaten safety, health and well-being. But is the industry really going to do that? No. It might do it with some of them, it won't do it at them all. I showed you the red and green hazards earlier on. We can do it with the green ones, we can't do it with the red. So therefore, we substitute health-enhancing policies, programs and practices, and where that doesn't work, we redesign the work environment for safety, health and well-being. And then for the really difficult ones that we can't fix, we're going to educate for safety and health, and we're going to encourage personal change. I've spoken to some senior managers in airlines, and they've told me, Paul, that's fascinating research you're doing, but I think we're okay. I don't think our pilots are affected as badly as you're saying. There's a saying, no evidence of a problem is not evidence of no problem. I think that's what's going on here. Pilots aren't talking about mental health, we're not disclosing it. 52% of the pilots that we sampled spoke to someone about a mental health issue. 52%, just over half. 80% of pilots were aware of their peer support program. 76% of those pilots said they would use pilot peer support if needed. Now it's the if needed part that's important, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. We asked those 52% of pilots who did speak to someone, who did they speak to? The most common was a spouse or a partner, followed by a medical professional, a close friend. Peer support program, 4% of pilots used peer support for a mental health problem. So 3/4 of them said they would use peer support if needed. They didn't specify what the if needed was. So they might be using it for other issues, but they're not using peer support for mental health issues. Will pilots disclose a mental health issue to their employer or their aeromedical examiner? Over 75% of pilots said they would not. Why would they not? The most commonly cited reason was fear of loss of license and long-term earnings, followed by a fear of stigmatization by their employer, not their colleagues, potential negative impact on career progression, and a fear of reprimand by their employer, fear of stigmatization by their colleagues, pride, and fear of loss of short-term earnings. The most common 4 issues there are all under the direct control of the employer. We asked the participants, the safety management practices at my airline adequately address issues concerning the support and management of pilot mental health and well-being? How many agreed? 10% of pilots agreed. Is it time to incorporate psychological health and safety into our safety management systems? I believe the word is toxic. and the only way we're going to clean it up is to incorporate that. So who's responsible for psychological health and safety, and where is the oversight? Is it the Occupational Health and Safety Departments in the airline, or is it HR? It's the organisational culture is doing huge damage to the mental health of pilots. So I would argue it's both. In terms of the authorities, then, is it the National Health and Safety Authority, or is it the Civil Aviation Regulator who should be responsible? Once again, I agree it's both. I think from a human performance and a flight safety context, it's the Civil Aviation Regulator. However, from an occupational health and safety context, I think it's the National Health and Safety Authorities. So, what are EASA and its health and safety counterpart EOSHA doing about this? Depends on where you look. I know in Ireland, where I'm based, rather than being a joint responsibility and an overlap, what we have instead is a gap where neither authority is actually doing what they're doing because they assume the other person is doing it, and they're not talking to each other about it either. So do we need laws? Do we need new regulations? No, we don't. We have the regulations. We just need to insist that the regulations are enforced. In Europe, EASA AirOps regulation ROGEN 200 says the operator should establish and implement and maintain a management system that includes the identification of aviation safety hazards, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to go through it all. It's there. The regulations are there in black and white. However, they're not being enforced. The health and safety regulations are the same. The employer shall have a duty to ensure that the safety and health of workers in every aspect related to work. They're not doing it. And no one is calling them out to do it either. I'm trying, but I don't see too many other people who are putting the pressure on them to say, guys, you need to start doing what you're supposed to do here, and you're not. So, is it time to incorporate psychological health and safety into our safety management systems? I hope I've convinced you that it is. Thank you.
Thank you.